Good evening my friends, and welcome back to Relax to Sleep. It is my privilege to guide you to sleep with this story. The music will continue to play, so they can accompany you a little longer while you sleep. Now, close your eyes and drift into sleep with today's story, A Slow Evening by the Fire. It was the kind of evening where the world seemed to exhale. A soft hush had settled over the countryside, and beyond the tall windows of the cottage at the edge of Hazelmore Hill, the sky turned from a muted gray to the gentle blue of twilight. Clouds passed overhead like slow-moving ships, their underbellies touched with fading light. The rain that had begun earlier in the afternoon had not stopped, but it had softened, growing into a patient rhythm against the glass. Inside the cottage, the fireplace crackled gently, its flames low but steady. The scent of burning oak filled the air, earthy, familiar, grounding. Near the hearth, a thick braided rug spread out beneath a pair of old armchairs, their cushions worn and welcoming. One of them, the green one with a knitted throw folded neatly over its back, held a woman with soft eyes and silver-streaked hair. Her name was Clara. She sat with her legs curled beneath her, a well-loved book open on her lap. Steam rose from the mug on the small table beside her, and the firelight cast a gentle glow on the pages, flickering like candlelight. She had lived in the cottage for many years. Long enough for the walls to know her footsteps, for the floors to creak only when she wasn't paying attention, and for the kitchen drawers to slide just a bit smoother under her hand. It wasn't a large home, 2 rooms and a loft, but it was hers. And on nights like these, it felt like the only place in the world. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees. Inside, Clara turned the page slowly. The story she was reading didn't matter so much. It was one she'd read before, many times, in fact, but that was part of the comfort. The same way some people played old songs or brewed the same tea, Clara found ease in familiar words. They asked nothing of her. They simply waited. She reached for her mug and took a small sip. Chamomile and honey. The kind of tea that eased into the bones. Near the window, the curtains shifted with the breeze that made its way through the tiny opening she always left cracked. Just enough to hear the rain. Just enough to remind her that she was warm. The fire popped softly. A log settled. Clara closed her eyes. She remembered the first time she'd come to Hazelmore Hill. The air had smelled of moss and distant wood smoke. She had stood on the porch of the then empty cottage, key in hand, and wondered what it might mean to choose stillness. She had been younger then, but tired in ways that had nothing to do with age. The quiet had called to her, and she had answered. Now, it was simply life. A slow, lovely unfolding of days. The rain continued. The fire flickered. Time stretched long and thin, like golden thread pulled gently through cloth. And Clara, nestled in her chair, let the evening settle around her. The light outside dimmed further, the last of the day slipping away behind the trees. Clara rose from her chair with the slow grace of someone who had nothing she needed to rush toward. She set her book aside on the little round table and stretched her arms overhead, feeling the soft pull of muscles long accustomed to gentle movement. The fire had burned low, and she reached for the basket of logs beside the hearth, selecting a piece of oak with a smooth, split grain. She placed it on the embers and gave it a gentle nudge with the iron poker, then added a smaller branch for kindling. A few moments later, the fire responded with a crackle and renewed glow. Clara didn't mind the quiet tasks. She found them grounding, bringing wood, lighting lamps, folding blankets, preparing tea. Each action was part of a rhythm she had built slowly over the years. Her days followed a quiet tide. Tending the garden, walking the winding lane behind the cottage, writing letters she sometimes never sent. She moved to the kitchen nook and filled the kettle again, setting it gently on the cast-iron stove. The sound of warming water was soft, almost inaudible beneath the steady whisper of rain. Her hands moved to the small shelf above the counter where she kept her teas. Loose leaf in glass jars, each one labeled in neat handwriting. Tonight, she reached for the lavender blend. A mix she had put together from the dried flowers in her garden and a hint of lemon balm. The scent was calming, the color like faded heather. As the water began to heat, she set a simple wooden tray with her cup, a small dish of honey, and a silver spoon. She'd inherited the spoon from her mother. The handle was worn smooth, the floral engraving barely visible now, but it was her favorite nonetheless. With the tea steeping, Clara moved to the window. She pulled back the curtain just a little more and looked out over the quiet path that wound past the stone fence and into the woods. Raindrops gathered on the glass, distorting the view into a dreamy mosaic of shadows and golden glow. She could just make out the porch lamp from the neighbor's cottage in the distance. A tiny flicker through the mist. She smiled, knowing it meant Oliver had likely just settled in for his evening, too. He lived alone, much like she did, though he had a pair of cats who often made appearances in her garden. They left little paw prints in the soil, sometimes curled up in her shed during summer heat, or watched the world from her fence posts in autumn. The kettle gave its gentle whistle. Clara turned, poured the water, and let the aroma of lavender fill the room. She returned to her chair with the tray, tucking the blanket over her lap once more. The fire glowed brighter now, casting a gentle orange shimmer across the wooden floor and walls. The whole room seemed to hum with contentment. Clara took her first sip of tea. Her gaze wandered again, this time to the mantel above the fireplace. Small tokens lined the wooden shelf, smooth river stones, a faded photograph of a beach at sunset, a candle in a deep blue holder, and a tiny clay owl gifted by a friend long ago. She traced the objects with her eyes, not out of habit but with the attentiveness of someone who saw them anew each day. Each piece was a part of her story, little threads of memory woven into the quiet fabric of her life. The rain softened even more, becoming a distant hush against the backdrop of the fire. The kind of rain that didn't need to fall so much as linger. That didn't ask to be noticed but offered comfort all the same. Clara let her thoughts drift. She remembered rainy days as a child, watching water trail down the windows of her family's cottage by the sea. She remembered her grandmother humming by the stove, the smell of baking bread, the feel of wool socks pulled up to her knees. It was strange, she thought, how certain moments returned, not when you called them, but when you were quiet enough for them to arrive on their own. The tea warmed her from the inside. The firelight flickered gently. And the evening deepened, slow and kind. She closed her eyes just for a moment, letting the quiet fold around her. In the stillness, the story of the night continued, not with events or urgency, but with presence. With breath. With the simple joy of being exactly where she was. Outside, the rain fell. Inside, the fire glowed. And Clara, wrapped in warmth and memory, sat peacefully in the heart of it all. The evening, now fully folded into night, deepened into something quieter still. Not silence, Elmira was never silent. But a lull, like the soft breath of someone drifting deeper into sleep. Clara remained in her chair, now with her legs stretched and feet propped up on the old wooden footstool. Her tea was nearly gone, just a warm trace in the bottom of the mug. The fire had settled into a bed of glowing embers, pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the blackened logs. Somewhere in the rafters above, a light tapping echoed in rhythm with the rain outside. Not sharp, not alarming. Just the water finding its way down the tin roof, then trickling into the old gutters and dripping from the eaves. It was a sound Clara had always found soothing. The rafters themselves were familiar companions. Thick, sturdy beams, dark with age, their grain patterns carved by time and smoke. She liked looking up at them when she couldn't sleep, tracing their shadows in the firelight. They reminded her of old trees, quiet, protective, permanent. Tonight, the beams framed the night's hush. A canvas for the shadows to stretch and soften. Clara glanced at the small mantel clock. Its hands moved slowly, obediently, each tick fading into the space between seconds. She had once thought she would tire of the ticking. But over the years, it had become something else. A kind of presence. A rhythm that kept pace with her own. From beneath the window came a gentle rustle. Clara turned her head. There, just outside, barely visible through the misted glass, was a shape she recognized. Barley, the neighbor's golden retriever. He often wandered during the rain, and tonight was no exception. She stood and padded over to the door in her thick socks, easing it open with a quiet creak. Barley stepped inside with a grateful shake, his fur damp and his eyes bright. He didn't bark or beg, he never did. He simply made his way to the rug near the fire and curled into a golden circle. Clara smiled and fetched a small towel to dab at his coat, murmuring softly to him as she worked. "There you are. Thought I might see you tonight." Barley sighed, content, and blinked at the fire. Clara sat again, now with a small basket of yarn at her feet. She pulled a half-finished scarf from within, the wool a deep forest green. Her fingers found the rhythm quickly, knit, knit, purl, knit, each motion practiced and gentle. As she worked, her thoughts wandered. Not in a hurried way, but like a slow stroll through the past. She thought of her first winter in the cottage, when the snow came early and stayed long. She remembered the smell of pine wreaths, the sound of carols from down the hill, the way the windows fogged with warmth and laughter. She remembered long walks through the woods, the crunch of leaves beneath boots, the scent of earth after rain. The way sunlight sometimes broke through the mist in sudden beams, like lanterns from the sky. Barley snored softly, his nose twitching. The rain picked up again, not with force, but insistence, tapping steadily against the roof, echoing in the eaves, a lullaby written in water. Clara's scarf grew longer. The fire dimmed slightly. The house settled into a deeper layer of stillness. She stopped knitting, not because she was done, but because her hands had paused. She placed the project beside her and leaned back, head resting on the chair. The room flickered with warmth and memory. In the quiet, 1,000 small stories moved through the space, unspoken, but present. The scent of lavender tea still lingered. The soft fur of a visiting dog warmed the floor. And in the rafters, The rain sang its song to the old beams, reminding them, and her, that night was a time not only for sleep, but for dreaming wide awake. Clara closed her eyes. Not to sleep. Not yet. But to feel, to remember, and to listen. And the cottage listened, too. When Clara opened her eyes again, the fire had faded to a soft red glow, and the room had slipped into deeper shadow. The only movement came from the gentle rise and fall of Barley's breath, his tail twitching now and then as if chasing something in his dreams. A faint mist clung to the windowpane, blurring the world outside into soft watercolor shapes. She stood and stretched once more, this time with a small, sleepy smile. The evening had become night, and the rain had turned to fog. She walked to the window and gently opened it wider. Cool air rolled in, damp and scented with cedar and moss. Somewhere, far off, an owl called, a single low note, floating across the woods. She lit a small lantern on the window ledge. It cast a golden circle of light through the mist, flickering like a signal. One light among many. She knew others in the village did the same. It was a quiet tradition in Hazelmore, a kind of shared goodnight, passed without words from house to house. Across the fields, she could just make out the lamp glowing in Oliver's kitchen. A little further, toward the hilltop, the faint glimmer of Mrs. Weatherby's porch light. She imagined Ivy still sketching beside her fire, the candle beside her stained with hours of thought. Clara turned from the window and gathered a few small things from the shelf, her journal, a fountain pen, the little leather pouch where she kept odds and ends of thoughts not ready for paper. She returned to her chair and opened the book on her lap. The pages inside were mostly filled with simple notes. Descriptions of clouds. The first day a flower bloomed. A line from a dream. They weren't stories, not exactly. Just pieces of time. Tonight, she wrote, the fire tonight felt softer. Like it knew the rain had done its part. Like it didn't need to shine, only glow. She paused, listening to the hush around her, then added, fog is the blanket rain leaves behind. I wonder if the stars wait behind it, patient and quiet. She closed the journal and set it aside, satisfied. Barley stirred and stretched his legs. Clara smiled and walked to the small basket near the hearth where she kept an extra blanket for him. She laid it gently across his back and patted his side. Good night, then, she whispered. She moved through the cottage, lighting 2 more lanterns, one in the hallway, one by the stair that led to the loft. She didn't need the light, not exactly, but she liked the way it made the house feel like it was breathing. Like the walls and beams and books and chairs all shared in the rest. Outside, the fog thickened. From the woods came the gentle rustle of deer or fox or some creature passing quietly through. In a place like Hazelmore, the wild moved alongside the stillness, never disturbing, never intruding. Clara paused at the door and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cooler now, brushing her cheeks and hands with soft fingertips. The garden beyond the steps was a blur of shape and shadow. She could smell the earth, dark and soaked and waiting. The leaves shivered with droplets. The whole world seemed to breathe in this quiet rain. The lantern beside her flickered. She stayed there a while, just watching. Not thinking about tomorrow, or yesterday. Not planning or remembering. Just being. The moon, somewhere above, was hidden behind layers of cloud and mist. But Clara imagined its presence, a soft eye watching the world sleep. And then, as if hearing an unspoken call, she turned and stepped back inside. The door closed with a soft click. The cottage wrapped itself around her once again. The night held steady. And in the warmth of glowing embers, beneath the slow-drifting fog and the hush of distant rain, another hour of peace was gently folded into the fabric of a slow evening by the fire. Later that night, long past the usual hours of wakefulness, a soft wind rose through the woods behind the cottage. It came not with force, but with curiosity, threading its way between the trunks of alder and pine, whispering through branches heavy with droplets. It slipped over the ridge and down Hazelmoor Hill, bending grass and nudging window panes like a visitor politely asking for entry. Clara, not yet asleep, lay in bed beneath her quilt. Her eyes traced the wooden ceiling beams, faintly visible in the flicker of lantern light still glowing from the hallway. Barley had made himself comfortable at the foot of the bed, a faint snore now and then punctuating the quiet. The wind reached the cottage and circled it, pressing gently against the shutters and eaves. It brought with it the scent of pine and damp moss, of distant riverbanks and the faintest trace of blooming ivy, though it was far too early in the year. Clara inhaled deeply. The cottage breathed with her. The ticking clock downstairs echoed faintly through the floorboards. Tick, tick, tick. A metronome for the night. Clara reached to the small table beside her bed and took a sip from the glass of water she kept there. The glass was old, cut with a simple pattern of stars and dots. It had belonged to her mother, passed down through quiet generations that treasured small things with long stories. Outside, the wind turned playful. It tugged at the chimes hanging near the porch, drawing a few soft tones, notes of brass and wood, ringing into the darkness. The tones faded into the fog, joining the sounds of branches creaking, water running beneath stones, and the distant cry of the owl again. Clara felt the weight of her days settle fully into the mattress. The fire downstairs would be nearly gone now, just a bed of soft glow, warming the room with memory rather than heat. She liked knowing it was there, even if she could no longer see it. She listened for a while to the wind's lullaby. It moved like a storyteller without words. Sweeping through the forest and over the fields, brushing over the roof, circling and swirling, before moving on. It carried the feeling of distance and closeness all at once. Of time past and time paused. Barley shifted and let out a quiet sigh, his paws twitching in some slow-motion dream. Clara smiled. The quilt around her was heavy and soft, and the pillow beneath her head had long ago taken the shape of her sleep. The lantern in the hallway flickered once, then dimmed, then held steady. The wind settled, having made its rounds. The fog held its place. The rain had passed, leaving only moisture clinging to leaves and rooftops like dew made of dreams. And as her eyes finally drifted closed, Clara felt the peace that only comes when the world outside and the world within share the same stillness. A final chime rang from the porch. A single drop of water fell from the eaves. And the night continued. Quiet, warm, complete. The first light of morning arrived not in a blaze, but as a gentle shifting of shadows. The fog had lifted just enough to reveal the garden beyond the cottage porch, every blade of grass and curve of leaf still jeweled with moisture. The world was hushed, not by darkness now, but by light that asked for nothing but to be noticed. Clara stirred beneath her quilt, blinking once at the ceiling before closing her eyes again for just a moment longer. There was no rush. No clamor of alarm clocks or appointments to meet. Just the slow pull of wakefulness, drawn gently by the scent of the world turning fresh and new. Barley yawned loudly and stretched, his paws pushing against the bed frame with sleepy determination. Clara chuckled softly, her voice scratchy with sleep. "All right, then," she said. "Let's begin again." She rose and wrapped herself in her thick robe, then padded barefoot across the wooden floor, which creaked in its usual comforting rhythm. She moved first to the window, as always, and opened it wide to let in the morning. The air was cool and damp, filled with the scent of wet bark, stone, and distant lavender. A robin perched on the stone wall, its chest puffed as it greeted the new day. Downstairs, the hearth was quiet, but Clara set to work reviving it. A few fresh logs, some crumpled paper, the flick of a match. Soon, the fire was humming once more. Not crackling, not roaring. Just a steady warmth, like breath drawn deep and easy. She made her way to the kitchen and put the kettle on again, choosing this morning a gentle blend of rose hips and apple blossom. While the water heated, she opened the back door and stepped outside. The world sparkled with dew. The mossy stones along the path glistened, and spiderwebs caught the light like delicate lace. The garden had soaked in the night's rain, and the soil gave off that unmistakable earthy perfume of newness. Clara picked a few sprigs of mint and thyme, brushing the wet from her hands as she returned inside. She set the herbs in a tiny vase by the window, their scent now mingling with the warmth of the brewing tea. Barley trotted to the door, tail wagging, and Clara opened it for him to take his usual morning patrol around the garden. He was never in a hurry, stopping to sniff familiar places, to greet the dew-soaked air as if checking in with old friends. By the time he returned, the tea was ready, and breakfast was on its way, porridge with honey, walnuts, and a splash of cream. Clara ate slowly, watching the morning unfold outside her window like a painting that changed by the minute. Today, the clouds were high and silver-edged, and birds fluttered through them in lazy arcs. Across the field, she could see the chimney from Oliver's cottage puffing faintly. Another day had begun in Hazelmoor, not with horns or announcements, but with small gestures of kindness, tea, fire, shared silence. After breakfast, she carried her cup back to the chair by the fire. She didn't pick up her book just yet. Instead, she let herself sit and watch the light play across the floor. A dance of gold and shadow, the sun filtered through wet leaves and linen curtains. The rhythm of the rain had passed, but its memory lingered. In the damp scent of the soil, in the hush that still held the air, in the glow of the cottage warmed once more. The fire crackled softly. Barley sighed and curled at her feet. Clara smiled and whispered, mostly to herself, "What a lovely thing, to begin slowly." And so the day, like the night before it, unfurled with quiet grace. Another chapter in a life well lived. Another breath in the long and gentle story of a slow evening by the fire. After the morning tea had been savored and the fire had resumed its steady pulse of comfort, Clara stepped into her boots and buttoned her cardigan. The fog had mostly lifted, revealing a world still touched by last night's rain. Everything glistened in the filtered morning light, the dewdrops on flower petals, the slick stones of the path, even the wooden gate at the edge of her garden, which creaked gently when she pushed it open. She didn't walk every day, but on mornings like this. Soft, cool, and filled with promise, it felt right to follow the path that meandered through the meadow beyond her gate. Barley trotted beside her, his paws making no sound against the damp grass. They passed the old oak tree with the hollow where robins nested in the spring, and then the weathered fence where wild roses grew in tangled bursts. The air smelled of everything fresh. Earth and wood and a hint of something floral that Clara couldn't quite name. She walked slowly, letting her fingers graze the high grass, feeling the coolness cling to her skin. It reminded her of childhood, of early mornings spent chasing shadows, finding pebbles shaped like hearts, and listening to the world wake up without haste. At the edge of the field stood the bench. Just a simple wooden thing, 2 planks, 4 legs, facing east. It had been there as long as Clara could remember, though no one ever claimed to have built it. Some said it had always been there, and maybe it had. She sat down and let the silence return. Barley curled at her feet again, panting softly. From here, she could see the edge of the forest, the tips of Hazelmoor's trees rising like a sleepy choir. In the distance, faint smoke rose from chimneys in the village, curling toward the sky like stories being told. The path curved back toward her cottage, though it could go farther. And some days it did. Through the woods, toward the brook, or up the hill to the weather station where the view was clear for miles. But today was for stillness. A soft breeze rustled the trees. A single bird chirped. The sound of the world was gentle and whole. She pulled her notebook from her cardigan pocket and opened it across her lap. The page from last night still carried her thoughts of fire and fog. She turned to a fresh page and, without much thought, began to write. Some mornings don't ask for anything. They give instead. A sky that doesn't hurry. A path that doesn't press. A moment that needs nothing but breath. She looked at the words and let them be. There was no need to revise. This notebook was not for perfection, only presence. Barley stirred beside her and leaned his head against her boot. She reached down and scratched behind his ears. "We're very lucky, aren't we?" she said quietly. He thumped his tail in reply. The sun rose a little higher, spreading a warmer light across the meadow. It caught in Clara's silver-streaked hair and made the wildflowers glow like little lanterns. Eventually, she stood again, slipping the notebook back into her pocket. The walk home was slower, not from tiredness, but from appreciation. She paused to pick a few sprigs of meadow sage, inhaling their clean, peppery scent. The gate creaked once more as she passed through, and she felt the familiar pleasure of returning to a space made sacred by quiet routines. Back inside, she hung her cardigan on the hook, wiped Barley's paws, and returned to the hearth, where the fire welcomed her as if no time had passed at all. Outside, the day stretched on. Inside, the peace remained. And the path she had taken, like so many before it, would wait for her again. Later that afternoon, after lunch had been cleared and the last of the morning sun stretched across the wooden floor in pale, flickering patterns, Clara stood before the drawer. It was the middle drawer of the writing desk by the front window. The one with the worn brass handle and the little chip in the corner that had never quite been repaired. She opened it slowly, almost reverently, as if greeting something long unspoken. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Some folded neatly, others loosely tucked between envelopes never sealed. Some yellowed with time, edges soft from handling. None had ever been mailed. She sat down with a quiet sigh, drawing the bundle into her lap. Barley, ever patient, settled by her feet and placed his head across her slippers. Clara sorted through them slowly. There were letters to her younger self, full of questions and reassurances. Letters to her parents, gone now many years. Letters to friends who had drifted away like autumn leaves on a stream. One, in particular, caught her eye. A letter addressed to no one. Just a piece of folded paper with the words, "If the silence ever speaks," written across the front. She opened it. The writing inside was softer, more meandering than her usual style. She had written it on a rainy night not unlike the one before last, when fog curled around the garden and she'd felt a longing she couldn't quite name. "If the silence ever speaks," it began, "tell it I remember everything it held for me. The stories I didn't know how to tell, the feelings I couldn't place. The way it made space for grief and healing alike. Let it know that its company saved me more than once." Clara read the letter twice. Then she folded it again, not to hide it away, but to hold it a little closer. There were also letters to people who might one day arrive in her life. A neighbor not yet met. A friend from some distant city. A child who would never be hers but who might need to know how soft the world could be when you let it hold you. She didn't feel sad reading them. Only full. Full of all the things she had felt and thought and seen. The quiet courage it took to feel deeply, and the stillness that had given her the space to write it down. She picked one letter at random, dated 2 springs ago, and read it with a fond smile. "Dear May," it began, "thank you for the rain and the lilacs. I'm learning to stop counting the minutes. To let the kettle whistle a little longer. To sit in the garden without needing to name each bird. It feels like healing. It feels like being real." She read a few more, then gathered them back into their bundle. She didn't tie them tightly. Just enough to keep them together. Then she placed them back into the drawer, letting her hand linger there for a moment before gently sliding it shut. Outside, the afternoon was beginning its long descent into evening. The clouds had returned, not dark, just heavy, like soft wool pulled across the sky. Clara stood and looked out the window. Tomorrow, perhaps, she would write another letter. Or maybe she wouldn't. Either way, the drawer would be there. The words would wait. And the cottage, the rain, the quiet, all of it, would listen. The soft knock came just as the first shadows of evening gathered in the corners of the cottage. It was a patient knock, deliberate and unhurried, as if given by someone who understood that the door would open in its own time. Clara, seated again in her favorite chair with a shawl over her shoulders and barley sprawled across the hearth rug, looked up from her knitting. Another knock. She smiled. Only one person in Hazelmore knocked like that. She stood and made her way to the door, her slippers brushing quietly over the floorboards. When she opened it, a gust of cool air slipped in, bringing with it the scent of rain-damp soil and something faintly metallic, brass or copper perhaps. "Evening, Clara," said Mr. Penley, the village clockmaker. He stood with his usual satchel slung over one shoulder and a slightly crooked smile beneath his graying beard. His coat was speckled with droplets, and he held a small, cloth-wrapped bundle in his hands. "Penley," Clara greeted, stepping aside. "You're a little early for our usual Thursday." "I thought I'd take advantage of the quiet," he said, stepping inside and unwrapping the bundle to reveal a modest-sized mantel clock with a walnut frame and brass inlay. brought back your little moon phase clock. All polished and ticking beautifully again." She ushered him in, clearing space on the mantel where the clock had rested for years before needing his gentle repairs. Henley placed it carefully in its spot, winding the key and tapping the glass face twice. The clock responded with a delicate tick and a soft chime that echoed through the room like a bell heard from far away. "It remembers its place," Clara said. "They always do," Henley replied, brushing imaginary dust from the wood. "Clocks don't forget, they just wait." Barley lifted his head briefly to acknowledge the guest, then resumed his nap. "Tea?" Clara asked. "If it's not too much trouble." "Never is." In the kitchen, the kettle hummed its way to a boil while the two old friends sat in the golden light of oil lamps. Clara poured 2 cups, hers with a touch of honey, his with a splash of milk, and they settled into the stillness that only old companionship could bear without effort. They talked in that way people who have known each other for years often do, gaps filled with sips of tea, thoughts shared with few words. Henley spoke of a tower clock in town that had finally given up its stubborn protest and chimed properly again. Clara told him about her walk through the meadow and the letter drawer she had opened after all this time. "There's something about quiet places that keeps old thoughts soft," Henley said. "And safe," Clara added. "Safe enough to be looked at." The mantel clock chimed again, just once, as if in agreement. When Henley rose to leave, the sky outside had gone fully dark, the moon beginning its slow arc above the trees. Clara handed him a jar of pear preserves and a folded note. "Next Thursday?" he asked. "Unless the clocks say otherwise," she replied with a grin. He chuckled, gave a small tip of his cap, and disappeared into the fog, his footsteps muffled by the softened earth. Clara closed the door behind him, her home once again filled with the sound of ticking, steady, gentle, sure. She stood before the mantel and watched the clock's hand move. Time didn't race here. It strolled. It lingered. It remembered. And so did she. As the night deepened and the soft tick of the newly repaired mantel clock joined the rhythm of rain once more brushing the rooftop, Clara turned her thoughts toward the bookshelf. It stood in the corner of the sitting room, slightly tilted from age, but firm and proud. The top shelf held the old novels. Leather-bound classics, pages yellowed and sweet with the scent of paper and time. Below that, her gardening journals, some hand-stitched, filled with diagrams and pressed flowers. Further down, books of poetry gifted and regifted, and at the bottom, a scattering of treasures that defied categorization, a pamphlet from a concert in her 20s, an out-of-print guide to local mushrooms, a faded booklet about constellations. Clara ran her fingers along the spines, selecting a slim, cloth-bound volume that held within it a collection of village stories gathered decades ago. Some were true, others embellished, all cherished. She carried it to the chair, tucked her shawl more closely around her, and opened to the first page. The Man Who Spoke to Trees. She smiled. It had been years since she'd read this one. The story told of a man who wandered Hazelmoor's woods each morning, whispering to oaks and willows, leaving gifts of bread crusts and shiny buttons. The village children once followed him in secret, curious and amused, until one day, a great windstorm came and passed over the village, damaging nothing but the school roof. The trees around the village stood unbroken. From that day on, the man was no longer mocked but greeted with nods and cups of tea. Clara remembered her father reading it to her, his voice low and warm, his thumb gently tracing the page as he spoke. She turned to the next story, The Cat That Crossed the River. This one was sillier, a tale of a mischievous feline who snuck onto a ferryboat and caused a minor panic when it jumped onto a passenger's hat. But nestled between the jokes was something more, a love letter to the peculiarities of small places and the charm of community memory. Barley's ears twitched in his sleep, as if hearing the rustle of pages in his dreams. Clara read aloud, softly, the final lines of the third tale, and though no one could explain how the bluebells bloomed through the frost, they agreed it must have been a kindness returned. She closed the book and held it against her chest for a long moment. There was comfort in these old stories, not just in their words, but in the knowledge that they had been shared across years, voices, and hearts. That someone long ago had written them, and someone now, her, was holding them close. She placed the book on the table and stood to dim the lamps. The fire was soft again, more glow than flame. The cottage was ready for sleep. Before retiring to bed, she stood before the shelf once more, adjusting a single book that leaned too far to one side. She looked at the rows of pages and bindings and memories. "Good night," she whispered, to the stories. And one by one, the stories settled in too. Clara moved about the cottage in slow, familiar circles, her steps guided by the golden pools of candlelight that bloomed here and there in the gentle dark. The night outside had deepened into stillness, and the fog clung close to the windows, blurring the edges of the world into soft uncertainty. The fire had gone to sleep completely now, leaving behind a bed of quiet coals that still offered the gentlest warmth. She didn't mind the coolness of the floor as she padded to the kitchen and opened the small drawer beside the sink. Inside were her candle stubs, half-melted remnants of evenings past, each one with its own history. She selected one, a pale blue candle that smelled faintly of cedar, and set it in the clay dish she'd made in a pottery class long ago. The flame she coaxed to life seemed to dance in recognition. She carried the candle to the small writing table beside the kitchen window and sat down with a sigh that came not from tiredness, but from fullness. The kind that follows a day with just enough of everything. Outside, the fog moved slowly, revealing and hiding patches of moonlight like a game played by the sky. Clara took a piece of parchment from the drawer and a fountain pen with a worn grip. She didn't know yet what she meant to write, and she liked it that way. Sometimes the candlelight helped shape the thoughts that didn't yet have names. She began with a date and a line, "There are nights when silence is the clearest voice of all." And from there, the words followed. She wrote about the clockmaker's visit and the way time seemed to rest differently in her home now. She wrote about the story of the man who spoke to trees, and how she'd never stopped believing some people might actually hear the woods. She wrote about Barley, who had spent the evening twitching in dreams, a loyal guardian of warmth. She paused to sip water, her hand resting gently over the words she just penned. Then she continued. "I think sometimes, we're all just candles waiting for the right room, the right moment, to be lit. And then, even when we're small, we glow." The candle flickered as if it agreed. The clock ticked in gentle rhythm. Eventually, Clara set the pen aside, folded the parchment, and slipped it into her journal. She closed the cover and rested her hands over it, breathing in the faint cedar and beeswax. Barley stirred and patted over, leaning his head against her knee. She reached down to ruffle his ears, smiling into the quiet. "Bedtime," she whispered. She stood, blew out the candle, and made her way up the loft stairs, each creak of the wood familiar as breath. As she climbed beneath the quilt, Barley leapt softly onto his spot at the foot of the bed. From the loft window, she could see just a sliver of clear sky, where 1 or 2 brave stars had pushed through. She didn't wish or hope. She simply watched them. And in the glow left behind by candlelight and memory, Clara let sleep arrive like a tide, gentle, slow, and sure. The next morning began with the softest blue light pouring over the hills and settling on the roof of Clara's cottage like a silk shawl. Birds chirped from the hedgerows and fence posts, and the air smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke, leftovers from a village waking in gentle stages. Clara opened her eyes slowly, stretching with the rhythm of one unhurried by alarm or schedule. She sat up, listened to Barley's quiet snoring, and smiled. Today was a day for bread. The decision wasn't made from necessity, but from ritual, an understanding that some days simply called for the grounding scent of yeast and flour. She moved about the kitchen with a quiet efficiency, tying her apron around her waist and setting out the ceramic mixing bowl that had belonged to her grandmother. The flour clouded into the air like powdered snow as she sifted it. Yeast dissolved in warm water, honey stirred in, and her hands worked the dough with practiced care. The act of kneading became its own meditation. Forward and fold. Press and turn. Each movement slow and sure, connecting her to something old and steady. Barley sat nearby, tail gently thudding in approval. While the dough rose near the stove, covered with a linen cloth, Clara tidied the kitchen and opened the windows. A breeze filtered through, rustling the pages of the journal still resting by the candle dish. She picked it up briefly, ran her fingers across the leather cover, then returned it to its shelf. Soon, the kitchen filled with the unmistakable aroma of bread baking. Clara stood by the open window, sipping tea, watching the steam curl into the morning air. From this spot, she could see the narrow village road and the ivy-covered gate of the cottage across the way. Later, she pulled the golden loaf from the oven and let it cool on a rack. It cracked faintly in the silence, releasing warmth and memory. Clara sliced into it only once it had cooled enough, buttering a thick piece and savoring the crunch of crust and pillowy crumb. She wrapped half the loaf in cloth and set it in a wicker basket with a jar of fig jam and a note written in her looping hand, just because. See. With Barley leading the way, they walked down the lane toward Oliver's gate. She left the basket on the step, knocked gently, and slipped away before he could answer, the fog of surprise sure to follow when he found it. Back at home, Clara washed the bowl, swept the flour from the counter, and set another candle in the window. The scent of bread lingered all afternoon, a reminder of something both simple and sacred. And as the day wore on, so did the quiet joy of having made something with her hands. Something that would warm another. It had been a good day. And it was still unfolding. The light outside softened into gold as the sun dipped low beyond the hills, casting long shadows across the quiet cottage. Clara set the table for one, not out of loneliness, but of custom, with care and intention. A linen napkin folded into thirds. A ceramic plate warmed by memory. A spoon laid gently atop the placemat woven from dried lavender stems. The soup simmered on the stove, a simple potato and leek recipe passed down through the years. She added a pinch more salt, a sprig of thyme from her window box, and stirred until the scent filled the kitchen with its earthy comfort. Barley nosed at her apron. Clara bent to rub his ears. "It's almost ready," she murmured. Outside, the garden was still. A few bees hovered lazily over the fading marigolds. The shadows had grown long and quiet. And in the distance, the occasional lowing of cows reminded her that the village around her breathed the same peace. She poured the soup into her bowl and placed a thick slice of her homemade bread alongside. The butter, soft and golden, gleamed under the amber lamp above the table. She took her time. The first bite was rich and grounding. The second was accompanied by a sip of cool water, and the third by a slow breath. She didn't eat fast. She didn't think about much. The taste, the warmth, the hush, they were enough. Barley, fed and now stretched out on the rug, sighed with the contentment of a day well lived. After supper, Clara carried her dishes to the sink and washed them by hand, humming a tune she couldn't quite place. A melody from childhood, perhaps, or something made up on a walk long ago. When the dishes were clean and stacked to dry, she opened the back door and stepped outside into the dusk. The sky had turned violet, brushed with streaks of rose and fading blue. The stars had begun to peek through, hesitant and lovely. She stood in the garden, wrapped in her shawl, and looked upward. A satellite passed overhead, just a glimmering dot tracking silently across the sky. She watched it until it vanished. Back inside, she lit the last candle of the evening and placed it on the windowsill. Its flicker joined the hush. In her chair once more, she picked up a book, not to read but simply to hold. Its weight was comforting, like a hand resting gently in hers. The night settled in full. And supper, the most ordinary of rituals, had left the house steeped in warmth. The fire had been rekindled after supper, not out of necessity, but as a kind gesture to the night. Clara crouched near the hearth, coaxing the flames from their coals with slow patience. As the wood caught and began to glow, the room filled once more with that special sort of warmth, not just heat, but memory, history, breath. She sat back in her chair with a small cushion tucked behind her and looked around at the cottage, bathed in amber firelight. Every object within view had a story. The quilt folded neatly on the settee had once covered her childhood bed. The iron kettle near the hearth had belonged to her aunt, known for her root stews and thick teas. Even the gentle scratches on the floor told tales of Barley's puppy days. The fire crackled. Outside, a breeze stirred through the hedgerow. Clara pulled her writing journal close again, not to write, but to turn back pages. She reread old entries, the ones written with laughter still clinging to the edges, and others penned on days when sorrow needed to spill. She paused at an entry from years ago, "The house feels quiet tonight." Not empty. Just listening. She remembered that night. The way the wind had moved through the chimney. The way the silence had offered something she couldn't name but had known she needed. Tonight was like that again. She glanced toward the small wooden clock on the shelf. It had stopped years ago and she had never fixed it. It was stuck at 7:47, Clara's favorite kind of hour. The light had always been softest then. Barley lifted his head, sensing the shift in her thoughts. She smiled and leaned over to scratch behind his ears. "What would you tell me, if you could speak?" she asked quietly. "Would you say it's all turned out just fine?" He huffed once, then rested his head back down, one paw flopping over his eyes. Clara laughed. "I suppose that means yes." She leaned back in her chair, hands folded over her belly, and let the moment wash over her. No music played, no conversation echoed. And yet, the room was full. Full of the voices that had passed through, the meals that had been shared, the naps and readings and nights when thunder knocked on the roof and the fire had been her comfort. This room had seen her grow older, slower, and, though she hadn't expected it, happier. She thought again of the letters in her drawer. The ones never sent. And perhaps she'd write another tonight, or perhaps she wouldn't. The fire would still burn. The night would still come. And the hearthlight would continue its quiet conversation with the shadows. The fire had settled into a steady rhythm, pulsing low and deep, like the breath of the cottage itself. Clara dimmed the last lamp, leaving only its glow to keep company with the quiet. She moved slowly now, not from fatigue but from reverence for this moment at the edge of sleep. Barley had already found his way to the foot of the bed, his body a warm stretch of comfort. The air was still, touched faintly by the scent of thyme and beeswax. Clara changed into her nightdress, folded her shawl carefully over the arm of the chair, and climbed beneath the quilt. The fabric was cool at first, then softened by her warmth. She turned onto her side, eyes fluttering closed, then open again just once more. A single candle remained lit on the windowsill, casting golden shapes on the beams above. Outside, the fog pressed close to the glass, the garden hidden, the world wrapped in cotton silence. She breathed in slowly. And out. Her thoughts were not sharp now. They moved gently, like leaves drifting down a slow river. She thought of the bread she'd bake again next week. Of the unopened letter from Ivy that she might read tomorrow. Of the firewood she'd need to gather soon. Each idea came and went, like dreams arriving before the dreamer. Barley stirred once, then let out a breath so deep it seemed to settle the entire room. Clara reached out to the bedside table and snuffed the final flame. Darkness wrapped around her like a lullaby. The clock ticked downstairs, soft and patient. The stars held their places in the sky. And Clara, resting in her little home tucked against the edge of the woods, drifted into sleep like a boat setting quietly out to sea. The first sound Clara heard was rain. Not the bold kind that drums on the roof, but a delicate tapping, like fingertips on window glass. It was the sort of rain that asked permission to arrive, a soft beginning to a new day. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking at the dim light that filtered through the curtains. The room was still wrapped in that blue-gray hue that belonged only to rainy mornings. Barley was still asleep, curled into a tight ball near her feet. Clara stayed in bed for a while, simply listening. The patter of rain, the occasional creak of the cottage settling, the faint tick of the clock downstairs, all of it conspired to make the world feel smaller, safer. Eventually, she rose, wrapped herself in her warmest cardigan, and stepped lightly down the stairs. The hearth was cold but the embers hadn't forgotten her. A bit of coaxing, a few kindling sticks, and the fire came back to life, slowly blooming like a morning flower. She lit a single lantern and placed it on the kitchen table. Its golden glow cast soft shadows across the walls. The rain outside thickened a little, not fierce, but steady, a gentle hush. Clara made oatmeal on the stove, adding a swirl of honey and a handful of chopped apples from her cellar. The scent filled the air with comfort. Barley came padding in, stretching his legs, yawning with a wide mouth and flopping ears. Clara placed a bit of porridge in his bowl too, with no apples, he'd never taken to them. After breakfast, she sat by the window and watched the garden melt in the rain. Everything shimmered, droplets gathering on branches, pooling on the stone path. A robin danced beneath the lavender bush, shaking its feathers. She reached for her journal, opened to a fresh page, and wrote, "There are days made entirely of softness. Today is one." Then she drew a little rain cloud in the corner of the page. Not sad, just thoughtful. With no errands and no visitors expected, Clara let the hours pass gently. She read a few pages from a novel she'd nearly forgotten, mended a tear in her cardigan sleeve, and made a pot of cinnamon tea that lasted through the afternoon. Outside, the rain never ceased. But inside, the day unfolded like a lullaby. And as evening approached once more, Clara found herself smiling at the quiet. The fire, the cat-like flicker of candlelight, the hush that threaded the air, they were all part of the story she was still writing. A story told best in moments like these. Late in the afternoon, when the rain had finally lightened to a misty veil over the village, Clara heard the soft creak of the gate and the unmistakable flutter of something slipping through the letter slot. She looked up from her knitting, Barley lifting his head as well. Clara walked to the door and bent to retrieve the single envelope. The parchment was thick, the ink a warm brown. Her name, written in Ivy's tidy, slightly tilted script, brought an instant warmth to her chest. She carried it to the table by the window and sat down, slipping a finger under the flap and carefully unfolding the page. It was dated nearly a week ago and smelled faintly of lavender. "Dearest Clara," it began, "I saw the storm rolling in and thought of your fire, your window, and the sound of your kettle warming the air. I hope you've been well. There's talk in the village of a music night next week, just flutes and fiddles, nothing grand, and I wondered if you might join me. Bring Barley. He's practically family to them all by now." The letter continued with little notes, about her sketches of the forest path, the fox that had trotted past her garden wall, the sudden joy she'd found in baking scones for the first time. Ivy's writing was meandering and gentle, like her voice. At the end was a line that made Clara pause. "It's strange how often I think of silence now, not as emptiness, but as space that waits to be filled with meaning." Clara smiled and folded the letter, holding it for a moment before slipping it into the pocket of her cardigan. She made a cup of tea and settled by the fire, the letter tucked under her hand as she thought of Ivy's cottage on the far side of the village, its tall windows and stone chimney, the vines that curled around her porch. "Shall we go, then?" Clara said softly to Barley, who wagged his tail and stretched as if he'd already known they would. The evening would come soon, and with it, the soft notes of fiddle and flute drifting over the fields. But for now, Clara let the moment linger. The rain outside had turned to a whisper. And her world, as always, felt full of quiet invitations. The clouds had parted by the time Clara wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the soft evening. A faint golden light still clung to the sky, and the first stars blinked awake above Hazelmoor. She carried a small tin of lemon biscuits and a folded blanket in a wicker basket. Barley trotted ahead, tail wagging, eager for the familiar path. The music night Ivy mentioned was being held in the village square, beneath the wide branches of the old chestnut tree. It wasn't far, just a walk across the fields and a short lane beyond the baker's, but Clara allowed herself plenty of time. This wasn't a journey to rush. As they walked, her boots whispered against the damp earth, and the smell of moss and sweet grass filled the air. The last of the rain glistened on hedgerows, and moths began their slow, aimless dances in the dusk. Here and there, windows glowed in the distance, lamps lit, curtains drawn back, shadows of villagers moving gently through their routines. When Clara reached the edge of the square, she paused. The scene was simple and lovely. Wooden benches were scattered around the circle, and lanterns hung from tree branches, bobbing slightly in the evening breeze. A few musicians stood tuning their instruments, an elderly man with a fiddle, a young girl adjusting the strings of a dulcimer, and Ivy herself with a silver flute cradled in her lap. Clara found a quiet spot on a blanket and laid hers beside it. She set the tin of biscuits on the shared table and gave Ivy a wave, which was returned with a bright smile. The music began softly, nothing bold or flashy, just a handful of melodies meant to meander through the air like the breeze. Notes curled around the trunks of trees, slipped into windows, and found resting places and hearts open to them. Barley lay beside her with his head on her boot. Clara leaned back, listening. She thought of all the nights like this that had come before and all the ones still waiting. Of how joy didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes, it walked beside you in the dark and hummed a tune you already knew. And when Ivy played a soft waltz, Clara closed her eyes and swayed just slightly, letting the music carry her deeper into the quiet, deeper into the world she'd made for herself, deeper into home. The music night faded like the echo of a dream. Clara and Ivy lingered long after the final note, helping collect the scattered cushions and empty cups. When the others had gone and the lanterns had been doused, Ivy gave Clara a look that needed no words. They both knew the evening wasn't over just yet. They walked side by side, the path lit by a single shared lantern. Barley padded behind them, content with the slow pace and the scent of earth rising after rain. Ivy's cottage, nestled near the edge of the forest, looked almost enchanted beneath the moonlight. Vines curled up the stone walls, and soft herbs grew in clay pots clustered beneath the windows. They stepped through the garden gate, its iron latch clicking gently shut behind them. The garden itself glowed silver with dew, and the air carried the scent of rosemary and lemon balm. Clara followed Ivy around to the back, where a small bench sat beneath a wide elder tree. It had become their place, unwritten and understood. "I almost forgot," Ivy said, reaching into her basket and pulling out 2 folded paper packets. "I saved these from the market. Wildflower seeds. I thought you might want to add them to your corner near the porch." Clara took them, smiling. "I've a spot just waiting." They sat together, their shoulders brushing now and then, the silence deep and companionable. The moon traced paths across the petals of sleeping flowers. Somewhere nearby, a nightjar called once, then fell quiet again. "Do you ever think," Ivy said softly, "about how all the quiet things are still speaking?" Clara nodded. "All the time. I'm glad we don't need to name everything," Ivy said. "Some of it can just be felt." Clara leaned back, letting the night cradle her thoughts. "I think that's how you know it matters." They didn't speak again for a while. Words weren't needed. The garden, the stars, the steady breath of earth. They were enough. When it was time to go, Ivy walked Clara to the gate. They hugged gently, like old songs remembered. Barley led the way home, nose down, tail steady. Clara walked behind him, one hand still warm from the shared cup of tea they hadn't quite finished, the other holding tight to the seed packets in her pocket. Back in her cottage, she placed them on the shelf beside her journal. Morning would come. And with it, something waiting to bloom. Morning light stretched long across the wooden floors, touching the base of Clara's chair, brushing the edges of her books, and warming the hearthstone where Barley now rested, head on his paws. The fire had gone out hours ago, but its memory remained in the hush and comfort woven through every corner of the room. Clara stood at the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of dandelion tea. Outside, dew shimmered like spun glass on the garden leaves. The sky was a soft watercolor, a mix of lavender and lemon. She had no plans today. No guests to greet. No errands to run. Only the kind of open hours that asked for nothing and offered everything. She stepped out onto the porch. The breeze tugged gently at her cardigan, bringing with it the faint scent of moss and morning fires from distant chimneys. A bird sang from the hedgerow, a clear note, bright as a bell. Clara smiled. The seed packets from Ivy waited on the small table near the door. She picked them up, ran her thumb over the folded corners, and walked toward the garden. She found the empty patch just beside the porch, where the soil had been turned not long ago in anticipation of something. She knelt, pressed her fingers into the dirt, and began to plant, quietly, slowly, whispering as she did so. Not words exactly, but intentions. Gentle ones. For kindness. For patience. For joy, however it might arrive. When she stood again, her knees creaked slightly and her hands were dark with earth. She looked around the garden, felt the breeze move across her face, and knew something had shifted, not in a grand, sweeping way, but in a way only she would notice. Back inside, she wrote just one sentence in her journal: "Today, I planted the future without needing to know what it will become." She closed the book and placed it beside the hearth. Then, she brewed another cup of tea, fed Barley, and sank into her chair. The house exhaled around her. A slow evening would come again. And she would be here for it.